The First World War taught the world one thing about anti-aircraft fire. It was almost useless. Pilots called it Archie, black puffs in the sky. Loud, terrifying, but rarely fatal. Thousands of shells fired. Dozens of planes hit. The math was brutal. A plane moving at just 100 miles per hour could cross a kilometer in less than 25 seconds. A shell took seconds to rise. Gunners had to aim not at the plane, but at where it would be. By the time the fuse ticked down, the bomber was gone. So they guessed. Fuses were little clocks, tiny gears ticking down. You spun the dial, loaded the shell, fired, and prayed that the clock inside matched the distance. Most of the time, it didn't. In 1918, German Zeppelins raided London. Anti-aircraft gunners filled the night with fire. Shells exploded everywhere, except near the airships. More than 1,000 rounds were fired for every Zeppelin destroyed. And that was against slow, giant targets. Airplanes were smaller, faster, harder to hit. By the end of the war, everyone knew the truth. Anti-aircraft fire was more about morale than effectiveness. Soldiers on the ground felt better when guns fired back. Civilians in cities cheered when they heard the thunder. But pilots? They laughed. By the 1930s, things had not improved much. Guns were bigger, shells faster, but accuracy was still miserable. A French study concluded that even the best crews needed more than 20,000 rounds to down a single bomber at altitude. 20,000. The cost was enormous. The effect almost none. And bombers were evolving. In 1918, a bomber carried a few hundred pounds of bombs. In the 1930s, new designs carried thousands. The B-17 Flying Fortress, first flown in 1935, could haul 4,000 pounds across oceans at 20,000 feet, at 250 miles per hour. Against that, time fuses were jokes. Artillery officers admitted it openly. "We fire blind," one British gunner said. "We hope." That is all. The Germans noticed too. When Luftwaffe planners drew up their strategy, they calculated Allied flak into their losses. And they were not worried. One German officer scoffed, "Anti-aircraft guns, they are noise machines." In Berlin, scientists at Krupp and Rheinmetall worked on better guns, bigger calibers, faster rates of fire. They built the famous 88mm, so deadly indirect fire against tanks. But as flak, it still relied on guesswork. Time fuses, stopwatch shells, black puffs, nothing more. The problem was not the gun. The problem was the fuse. No matter how big the shell, if it didn't explode at the right moment, it was worthless. And the right moment was almost impossible to predict. Airplanes zigged, they climbed, they dived, they twisted. They did not fly straight lines like the textbooks showed. By the late 1930s, commanders knew if bombers came in mass, cities were doomed. Flak would roar, but the planes would get through. The Blitzkrieg concept rested on this. Bombers would strike deep, shake morale, and overwhelm defenses. And everyone believed it would work, because until then, it had. September 1940. The Blitz begins. Londoners hear the sirens. They run for the underground. Families huddle on platforms clutching children. Above them, the night sky fills with bombers. The Luftwaffe comes in waves. Heinkel 101s, Dornier 17s, Junkers 88s, hundreds at a time. And the guns open fire. The roar shakes the city. Barrages of 3.7-inch guns, the British heavy flak. Shells arc upward, exploding in black blossoms. Civilians cheer. "Give it to them," they shout from rooftops. But the truth? The shells almost never connect. Records are cruel. In the first 24 days of the Blitz, anti-aircraft batteries fired 267,000 rounds. They destroyed just 24 German planes. More than 11,000 shells per kill. 11,000. And that was on a good day. For the men pulling the lanyards, the frustration was unbearable. "We knew most of what we fired never hit," one gunner admitted later. "It was like throwing rocks at the moon." Yet they fired anyway. because what else could they do? London burned. The docks, the warehouses, St. Paul's Cathedral shrouded in smoke. Fire brigades fought flames while above them. The sky flashed with futile bursts. Germans noticed. Pilots mocked the flak. The black puffs mark the way. One Luftwaffe crewman joked, "We fly between them." Even Churchill saw the weakness. He praised the gunners for morale but knew the numbers were grim. "The cost of ammunition is frightful," he wrote, "for very little return." It wasn't just London. Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool. Everywhere the bombers flew, the pattern repeated. Cities pounded, guns blazing, almost no effect. And the Allies knew the math. A single German bomber might drop 2 tons of bombs in one mission. To stop him, defenders might fire thousands of pounds of steel skyward, with almost no chance of success. The imbalance was terrifying. Civilians began to question, "Why do we even have these guns?" One woman asked after losing her home in the East End. "They make noise, but they don't stop the bombs." The truth was hard to deny. Anti-aircraft fire was psychological. It made people feel defended. But in reality, it was little more than fireworks. And the Luftwaffe counted on it. German strategy assumed that flak would waste resources without results. They trusted that fear and exhaustion would do what shells could not. And for a time, it worked. Factories slowed, families fled cities, children were evacuated to the countryside. Morale dipped. But something else happened too. As German bombers flew almost unopposed, Allied scientists watched carefully. They studied trajectories. They calculated probabilities. They filled notebooks with data. They saw the futility. And they began asking dangerous questions. What if the shell didn't need a perfect guess? What if the fuse could know? The Blitz showed the world one truth. Anti-aircraft fire, as it was, could never save a city. If the war was to be won, the very heart of the fuse had to change. And across the Atlantic in America, a revolution was already stirring. In Washington, the news from London hit like thunder. Reports from Britain told the same story again and again. Thousands of shells fired. Almost no planes destroyed. Cities burning. The U.S. Army knew it already. Their own gunners had tested the numbers. At altitudes above 15,000 feet, the chance of a shell hitting a bomber was less than 1 in 1,000, even with well-trained crews, even with the best fire control. It was hopeless. But America had a choice: do nothing and accept that bombers would rule the skies, or gamble on the impossible. The impossible had a name: the proximity fuse. The idea was simple, almost childish. What if a shell could explode when it came near a plane, not on a timer, not on impact, but automatically? A fuse that sensed its target. But how? Scientists sketched ideas: sound detectors, light sensors, tiny radars. Each theory seemed absurd. Could a miniature radio even survive being shot from a gun? The shock alone destroyed most instruments, but the need was desperate. By 1940, the U.S. had entered a scientific arms race. Britain had radar. Germany had rockets. America needed something extraordinary. Enter the NDRC, the National Defense Research Committee. Civilian scientists pulled from labs and universities. Bell Labs, Johns Hopkins, MIT. Men who had built radios, telephones, oscillators, now asked to build a fuse that could think. The orders were clear: make it work at any cost. The secrecy was absolute. The proximity fuse became as classified as the Manhattan Project. Generals feared only one thing: capture. If a single fuse fell into German hands, the advantage would be gone. Factories began experiments. Tiny vacuum tubes had to be shrunk to fit into a shell. Circuits had to be ruggedized to survive 20,000 Gs of acceleration. Power sources had to last only seconds, just long enough to reach a bomber and detonate. Failure was constant. Shells misfired, tubes shattered, circuits fried. But then, in a test field in 1941, a miracle. A shell rose, spun, armed itself, and as it passed within yards of a drone aircraft, it exploded. Not on a timer, not on impact, but because it sensed the target. The observers were silent. Then they cheered. It worked. The age of guesswork was ending, but it would not be easy. America still had to build them by the millions. They had to be kept secret. They had to be tested in combat. And if Germany ever got one intact, the shock would be over. The advantage lost. So orders went out. Every fuse was guarded, every dud destroyed. Soldiers were told, if you see one unexploded, smash it with a hammer. Do not let the enemy see. This was more than a weapon. It was a revolution. And when German scientists finally did encounter it, their reaction was not disbelief. It was shock, because in that moment, they realized the Allies had turned every anti-aircraft shell into a guided missile. The war in the skies would never be the same again. 1940. The Blitz had begun. London shook every night. Sirens wailed, searchlights cut the sky, and then the bombers came. Hundreds of Heinkels, Dorniers, Junkers. Engines droning, formation after formation. Anti-aircraft crews fired everything they had. 3.7-inch guns, Lewis machine guns, even rifles. Anything that could shoot. The sky bloomed with black bursts. Civilians cheered when they saw the flashes. They thought it meant protection. It didn't. The math was merciless. To bring down one bomber, British crews sometimes fired more than 20,000 shells. 20,000 for a single kill, and the bombers kept coming. Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, London again and again. The flak thundered, but it was mostly noise. German pilots mocked it. The black puffs guide us, one Luftwaffe navigator joked. They mark the road. Churchill praised his gunners in speeches. He had to. Morale demanded it. But in private, he knew the truth. The cost of ammunition is frightful, he admitted, for very little return. For the British public, it was worse. Night after night, bombs rained down. Families huddled in the underground. Children slept on train platforms. Fire crews fought blazes until dawn. And the guns? They fired. They thundered. But they didn't stop the bombs. People began to ask, what's the point? One East End mother said after her home was destroyed, "The guns make a racket, but they don't stop the fires." She was right. The Luftwaffe calculated losses into their plans. A few bombers lost per raid. Acceptable, replaceable. Germany was winning the air war. And flak was failing. The lesson was obvious. If bombers could come in mass, cities were doomed. Flak alone could never stop them. The skies belonged to the attacker. And for German commanders, that was the great advantage. They believed the Allies had no answer. But across the ocean, American generals and scientists were watching, counting, calculating. And they were asking a question Britain no longer dared to ask. What if there was a way to make every shell count? Across the Atlantic, America watched carefully. They saw London burn. They read the reports. They studied the numbers. And the numbers were terrifying. Tens of thousands of shells, dozens of bombers destroyed. Almost no effect. If Britain couldn't defend its skies, how could America defend its cities? The U.S. Army Air Corps faced the same math. On training fields, gunners practiced against drones. Remote-controlled planes buzzed overhead. Anti-aircraft crews fired until their shoulders ached. The result? Failure. The gunners hit less than 1% of the time. Shells exploded too early or too late. Almost never close enough. It didn't matter how well trained the crews were. It didn't matter how fast the computers calculated firing solutions. The flaw was built into the fuse. Time fuses, stopwatch fuses, tiny mechanical clocks inside the shells. You spun the dial. You guessed the flight path. You prayed the clock matched the bomber's position at 20,000 feet. Most of the time, it didn't. One U.S. general admitted it bluntly: "We fire blind." The problem was even worse against the new heavy bombers. The B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-24 Liberator. Big, fast, high. A single bomber could carry 4,000 pounds of bombs across an ocean, and America knew Germany had their own. If Luftwaffe bombers ever crossed the Atlantic, New York could burn like London, Washington could burn like Coventry, and the anti-aircraft guns would be powerless to stop it. The nightmare wasn't just German bombers, it was Japanese too. In the Pacific, America's defenses were even thinner, bases vulnerable, fleets at risk. The U.S. faced a truth it could not ignore. If the age of guesswork continued, the skies would be lost. Something had to change. But what? More guns, bigger shells, faster computers? They had tried it all. The only answer was something radical. Not a bigger shell, not a faster gun, a smarter fuse. One that didn't rely on clocks, one that didn't rely on luck, one that could think. Scientists began whispering. Engineers sketched ideas. Could a fuse use sound? Could it use light? Could it use radio waves? It sounded crazy. Electronics were fragile. Radios broke if you dropped them. How could they survive the shock of being fired from a cannon? The idea seemed impossible. But the impossible was now the only hope. And in Washington, desperate generals were ready to gamble. The problem had a name: the fuse. Tiny, simple, deadly, or at least it was supposed to be. But time fuses were liars. Mechanical clocks, fragile gears. They ticked, they spun, they guessed, and most of the time, they guessed wrong. America needed something else, something impossible. What if the fuse didn't guess? What if it knew? The idea spread in whispers. A fuse that could sense a target, that would detonate not by timer, not by luck, but by proximity. Close enough was enough. The concept wasn't new. Scientists had dreamed of it in the 1920s. Papers speculated about radio triggers. Engineers laughed. Radios broke if you dropped them. How could they survive the blast of a gun barrel? Still, the question refused to die. The National Defense Research Committee was born, the NDRC, a group of scientists turned soldiers, Bell Labs, Johns Hopkins, MIT. Men who built telephones and radios now asked to build weapons. The orders were blunt. Solve anti-aircraft fire, make the fuse work at any cost. The secrecy was absolute. The project was classified at the same level as the Manhattan Project. Only a handful knew the scope. Every failure was buried, every report locked away, and there were failures. Many. Vacuum tubes shattered, circuits burned, fuses armed too early, fuses armed too late. The shock of a shell leaving the barrel was 20,000 Gs, 20,000 times the force of gravity. Enough to smash glass, crush filaments, snap solder. Electronics had never faced that before. Most scientists said it couldn't be done. You can't fire a radio from a gun, one engineer declared. But others refused to give up. They built smaller tubes, rugged tubes, tiny glass bulbs the size of a fingertip, reinforced, hardened, made to survive the unimaginable. They designed circuits that came alive in milliseconds, oscillators that pulsed, antennas that listened, triggers that fired. The first tests were disasters. Shells detonated on the ground. Some never detonated at all. Others blew up near the guns, scattering shrapnel among the crews. Soldiers cursed, scientists swore, generals frowned. But progress came. Slowly, one shell flew, armed itself, past a drone target, and detonated. Not by timer, not by guesswork, by proximity. Observers stared in silence. Then they cheered. It worked. For the first time in history, a shell exploded because it knew it was close. The impossible was now real, but it had to stay secret. If Germany ever captured one, they would copy it. They would build their own. Orders were clear. No unexploded fuse could ever fall into enemy hands. If one landed intact, soldiers were told to smash it with hammers, burn it, destroy it. This was not just another weapon. This was revolution. And soon, German scientists would discover it the hard way. They would look at the fragments. They would study the circuitry. And they would be shocked, because America had done the impossible. It began with failure. Shells that misfired. Shells that exploded too early. Shells that didn't explode at all. The soldiers on the test range cursed. The scientists shook their heads. Generals frowned. Everyone knew the truth. The idea was insane. A fuse that could sense its target? A tiny radio riding inside a shell? Electronics tough enough to survive 20,000 Gs of acceleration and thousands of revolutions per second? Impossible. But they kept trying. Bell Labs, Johns Hopkins, MIT, dozens of labs and secret shops across America. Vacuum tubes had to be shrunk. Circuits had to be hardened. Antennas had to be folded into a shell no bigger than a fist. Failure after failure. But then, in 1941, a miracle. A test range, a clear sky, a drone aircraft buzzing overhead. The gunners loaded a shell. The scientists watched. The officers held their breath. The shell roared out of the barrel. It spun, it climbed, it armed, and then it exploded. Not on a timer, not on impact, but because it sensed the drone. The first proximity fuse had worked. Silence fell. Then cheers erupted. Men shouted, clapped, embraced. After months of failure, they had done the impossible. One scientist later recalled, "It was as if the shell had a brain." Word spread quickly, but only to those cleared to know. Reports were stamped secret, files locked away. Even generals who asked too many questions were told, "You don't have clearance," because everyone understood. If the enemy got this, the war would change overnight. But if America kept it secret, the skies would belong to them. The next step was brutal testing. Not one success, not 10, hundreds, thousands. The fuses were fired from every gun imaginable. 5-inch naval guns, 90mm Army flak, even field artillery. Every test asked the same question. Could it survive? Most worked, some failed. Every failure was dissected, studied, fixed. Soon the miracle became routine. Shells armed themselves in flight. Oscillators pulsed. Tiny antennas searched the air. When a plane came close, the circuits triggered, detonating at the perfect moment. The effect was stunning. Hit probability soared from less than 1% to almost 50%. A single battery could do the work of dozens. One officer watching a test whispered, This will win the war." But they couldn't celebrate too loudly. Not yet. Because the danger wasn't just that the fuse might fail. The danger was that the enemy might find out. Washington classified the project at the highest level, as secret as radar, as secret as the atomic bomb. Only a handful of generals knew the details, fewer politicians. Scientists signed oaths. Workers swore silence. Factories were hidden. Reports locked away. One rule echoed through every meeting. The enemy must never see it. Because if Germany ever captured one, they would copy it, improve it, use it, and the shock would vanish. So orders were brutal. If a proximity fuse failed to explode, it had to be destroyed immediately. Crews carried hammers, axes, thermite grenades. If they saw a dud, they smashed it, burned it, obliterated it. Better to lose a shell than to lose the secret. Production began. It wasn't easy. Each fuse was a tiny masterpiece of electronics. Miniature vacuum tubes, rugged circuits, delicate antennas. Factories had to be retrained. Workers had to be taught new skills. Women on assembly lines soldered parts smaller than their fingernails. Quality inspectors rejected anything less than perfect. One cracked glass tube could mean failure. One faulty solder joint could mean disaster. Yet the output grew. By 1942, tens of thousands were being built. By 1943, hundreds of thousands. By the end of the war, more than 20 million. 20 million. It was one of the greatest mass production feats of the war. And yet, almost no one outside the project knew it existed. Even soldiers who fired the shells were told little. Their manuals simply called it the VT Fuse, variable time, a harmless name to hide the truth. But the men on the inside knew. They called it what it really was. The secret weapon. The secrecy spread to the battlefield. Generals argued. Should it be used in Europe against the Luftwaffe? The risk was enormous. If one dud landed in Germany, scientists at Krupp or Siemens would tear it apart. The Allies couldn't afford that. So the first combat orders were cautious. Use it at sea. Use it in the Pacific. Against Japan, the risk was lower, the chance of recovery smaller, and the need was desperate. American ships had faced waves of dive bombers and torpedo planes. Kamikazes would soon come. Guns firing thousands of shells had little effect. But with the new fuse, the odds changed overnight. The first combat test came in the Pacific. American ships on patrol, Japanese planes inbound. Until now, every raid followed the same pattern. The gunners opened fire. The sky filled with black puffs. Explosions too high, too low, too far. Sometimes they hit. Most of the time they didn't. Pilots broke through. Torpedoes dropped. Bombs fell. Ships burned. But this time, something was different. The guns fired. Shells armed themselves. And as Japanese planes dived, they exploded. Not in the distance, not in the void. Right next to wings. Right next to cockpits. One plane disintegrated instantly. Another caught fire. A third spiraled into the sea. The gunners blinked. They had never seen anything like it. And then they cheered. Because suddenly, their fire mattered. Word spread quickly. Sailors whispered in mess halls. Officers wrote stunned reports. Accuracy improved tenfold. Enemy losses unprecedented. On one ship, a commander counted 6 enemy planes destroyed in minutes, more than his crew had managed in months. For the Japanese, the shock was immediate. They had faced flak before. It was loud, it was frightening, but it was rarely fatal. Now, it was lethal. Raids that once struck home now ended in disaster. Formations torn apart. Torpedo planes vanishing in fireballs. Dive bombers blown out of the sky. Pilots returned, if they returned at all, shaken. Their guns are different, one survivor told his commander. The sky itself explodes beside us. The Japanese command didn't understand. They thought it was luck, or new training. They didn't realize it was technology. The Americans kept the secret. They didn't boast. They didn't explain. Reports were buried. Official communiques downplayed the success. The fewer who knew, the safer the secret stayed. Battle after battle, the results repeated. In the Solomons, at Guadalcanal, in countless raids across the Pacific. American ships that once prayed for survival now fought with confidence. A destroyer's captain put it bluntly, "Before, we were targets. Now, we are hunters." The effect on morale was staggering. Crews no longer felt helpless against the skies. Gunners took pride in their aim, knowing every shell had a chance. And the numbers proved it. Kill ratios soared. Planes fell in dozens. Japanese raids that once crippled fleets now ended with shattered formations and empty seas. For the first time, America could truly defend itself against mass air attack. And it was only the beginning, because soon the fuse would come to Europe. And when German scientists finally saw what it could do, their reaction would be the same as the Japanese pilots who first faced it: shock, stunned disbelief, and fear. The Pacific had proven it worked. Japanese planes fell from the sky. Raids ended in disaster. Sailors cheered. Scientists smiled. Generals nodded. But Europe was another story. Germany was different. If even one dud landed intact, German scientists at Krupp, Siemens, or Peenemünde would rip it apart. They would see the tiny tubes, the circuits, the antenna. They would copy it, improve it, turn it back on the Allies. That could not happen. So for months, the proximity fuse stayed out of Europe. American ships used it in the Pacific. Anti-aircraft batteries guarded carriers. Artillery on islands smashed Japanese raids. But in Europe, still forbidden. Generals argued. They needed it. They begged. They wrote memo after memo, because the skies over Europe were hell. Daylight raids sent thousands of B-17s and B-24s into Germany. The Luftwaffe tore into them. Flak filled the sky. Fighters shredded formations. Losses were horrific. At night, the RAF hammered German cities. Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne. Flak roared, but Allied bombers still pressed through. And the ground? The ground was worse. Every Allied advance in Italy faced German artillery. Mortars, machine guns, counterattacks, every inch cost blood. Commanders wanted the fuse, needed the fuse, because proximity wasn't just for the sky. It worked on land, too. A shell that could explode above the ground, not on impact, not buried in mud, but in the air, showering shrapnel down. Perfect against infantry. Perfect against troops in open ground. Perfect against counterattacks. And the Allies were desperate for an edge. Still, Washington hesitated. The secret was too valuable. Until late 1943, that's when the gamble came. The order was given. Small shipments of fuses would be sent carefully, quietly, to Italy, to the Mediterranean. The risk was real, but the need was greater. The Allies were ready to test their secret weapon against Germany itself, Italy. Winter 1943. The mountains were brutal, snow, mud, and German artillery everywhere. Allied troops advanced yard by yard. Each counterattack slammed into them. Each night brought more shells. And then, the new fuse arrived. The gunners loaded them carefully. Manuals said little. Just 2 letters, VT, variable time. Nobody knew what that meant. Not really. The first fire mission began. German troops massing on a ridge. Perfect target. The shells screamed overhead. And then, they exploded above the ridge. Not in the mud, not buried in snow, in the air. Shrapnel rained down. German soldiers dropped instantly. Entire formations shattered. The Allied infantry stared. They had never seen artillery do that before. The effect was devastating. One officer wrote in his diary, "It was as if the hand of God reached down." The enemy simply vanished. Word spread quickly. American gunners whispered about magic shells. British infantry called them air bursts. The Germans didn't understand. At first, they thought it was luck, perfect timing, better fire control, but then it kept happening. Every counterattack met the same fate. Troops caught in the open were shredded. Machine gun nests silenced. Mortar teams erased. German commanders grew suspicious. Something was wrong. One survivor later said, "It was uncanny. Their shells always burst above us. Always in the worst place. We felt naked." The shock grew at sea, too. In the Mediterranean, German planes attacked Allied shipping. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers. They had succeeded before. Ships had burned. Convoys had scattered. Now, they died in droves. Gunners fired the new shells. Bursts erupted not yards away, but right next to the wings. Planes fell by the dozens. Crews cheered as attackers disintegrated. German pilots returned shaken. "The flak is too precise," one reported. "It bursts beside us, not around us. It is unnatural." By early 1944, the truth was impossible to ignore. Germany was facing something new, something terrifying, and their scientists had no idea what it was. December 1944, the Ardennes. Snow fell, fog clung to the forests. German tanks rumbled forward. Infantry poured through the gaps. The last great gamble of the Reich had begun. The Allies were caught off guard. Lines buckled, towns fell, supplies burned, and then the counterattack came. American gunners loaded their VT shells, batteries hidden in the woods, frozen crews working in silence, German infantry massed in the snow, columns moved through clearings. The order came. Fire! Shells screamed overhead, and then they exploded above the trees. Shrapnel rained down like steel snow. Entire companies were shredded in seconds. Soldiers scattered, screaming, bleeding. One American officer said, "It was slaughter, like nothing I'd ever seen." German survivors were stunned. The shells knew where we were. One prisoner confessed, "They burst over our heads every time." The Ardennes offensive began to collapse. But it wasn't just the forest battles. London faced a new terror, the V1 flying bomb, Hitler's vengeance weapon, pilotless, fast, deadly. Launched from France, they roared toward the city. Civilians called them buzz bombs. Traditional flak struggled. Too fast, too small, too hard to hit. Until the proximity fuse arrived. Gunners fired, shells armed, bursts erupted right next to the V1s. One after another, the flying bombs exploded in midair. Accuracy soared. Interceptions doubled, tripled. Whole waves of V1s never reached London. Civilians who once braced for impact now watched the sky with hope. The invisible wall was real. For German commanders, the shock was crushing. Their last gamble in the Ardennes was bleeding out in the snow. Their vengeance weapons were being swatted from the sky, and they had no answer. One Luftwaffe officer wrote bitterly, "We no longer fight men. We fight a machine that thinks." By early 1945, the Allies had turned the proximity fuse loose. Every front, every battlefield. The skies were a trap, the ground a killing field. German scientists studied fragments, but it was too late. They couldn't replicate it. They couldn't stop it. The shock was total, and the war was slipping away. Winter 1944. The Ardennes offensive was bleeding out. German prisoners whispered about magic shells. Infantry swore the air itself exploded. Pilots muttered about flak that burst too close, always too close. Rumors reached Berlin. The High Command dismissed them at first. Soldiers exaggerate. Panic spreads easily. Superstitions, one general scoffed. But then came the fragments. Scraps of metal collected from battlefields, shattered pieces of fuse casings, burnt wires, tiny glass tubes. German scientists examined them. They expected clockwork, springs, gears. Instead, they froze. Vacuum tubes, circuits, electronics, inside a shell. Impossible. A fuse that carried a radio, that survived the launch shock, that armed itself in flight. The scientists stared at the fragments in disbelief. One engineer whispered, "This is 20 years ahead of us." Reports were written, stamped Geheim, circulated among top research centers, Peenemünde, Krupp, Siemens. Everywhere the conclusion was the same. The Allies had built something new, something terrifying. The word spread through the laboratories. Abstandssunder, distance fuse, proximity fuse. Shock turned to fear, because the implications were clear. Anti-aircraft fire was no longer guesswork. It was science, and Germany had no defense. The Luftwaffe demanded answers. Why were V1s falling in such numbers? Why did Allied flak burst right beside their bombers? Why did American artillery in the Ardennes slaughter entire battalions in seconds? The scientists had no comfort to give. Their fuses are electronic. One report admitted, "We do not possess the capability." The discovery shook them. Germany had prided itself on technology. Jet fighters, rocket planes, the V2, the first ballistic missile. But here, in the heart of the battlefield, America had leapt ahead. Not with rockets, not with jets, but with a fuse. A tiny brain hidden inside a shell. And for the first time, German scientists realized they were behind. Dangerously behind. The fragments told the story. Vacuum tubes, circuits, electronics inside a shell. Germany had never seen anything like it. The order went out, replicate it. immediately. Krupp engineers began experiments. Siemens built prototypes. Peenemünde scientists sketched designs, but nothing worked. The first tests failed. Tubes shattered on firing, circuits burned out, fuses armed too early or too late. Every attempt ended in frustration. German industry simply wasn't ready. They had rockets that touched the edge of space, jets that broke the sound barrier in dives, but they couldn't build a tiny fuse that worked inside a shell. The contradiction was humiliating. The problem was production. Vacuum tubes in Germany were large, fragile, delicate. The American fuse used miniature tubes hardened against shock. The Germans tried to copy them. They couldn't. Factories lacked precision. Materials were scarce. Copper, aluminum, tungsten, all in short supply. And above all, time was gone. It was late 1944. The Allies were at the Rhine. The Red Army was at the Vistula. Berlin itself was under threat. There was no time for years of research. German scientists admitted the truth in secret. One report concluded, "The enemy's fuse technology is beyond our present capability. It cannot be replicated during this war." Another noted bitterly, "This single invention has reduced the effectiveness of our Air Force and our counterattacks to almost nothing." The shock ran deep. Germany had always believed it led in science, the jet engine, the rocket, synthetic fuels. Now they faced an invention so simple and yet so devastating that it had broken their armies in the field, and they couldn't copy it. Prisoners of war later recalled the despair. "We knew our weapons were useless," one artillery officer confessed. "Their shells burst in the air, always above us. We felt naked, exposed, hopeless." The scientists felt the same. They could calculate trajectories. They could launch rockets to London, but they could not match the tiny brain of an American shell. Spring 1945. The Reich was collapsing. Berlin starved, cities burned, armies retreated on every front. And still, the reports came in. German infantry torn apart by airburst shells, Luftwaffe bombers ripped from the sky by flak that always knew where they were. WWII flying bombs swatted down before they reached London. The secret was out. The Allies had proximity fuses, millions of them, and Germany had nothing. In laboratories at Peenemünde, scientists worked until the end. They studied fragments, sketched diagrams, begged for resources. But there was no copper, no tungsten, no time. The war was lost, and they knew it. One researcher wrote bitterly in his notes, "This invention has undone our strength. Against such weapons, our courage is meaningless." Prisoners later remembered the despair. "We feared the sky," one German officer said after capture. "Every burst was on target. Every shell seemed guided. We told our men, the Americans have found a way to make their artillery think." Another confessed, "When the shells began to burst above us, we knew the war was over. There was nothing left to fight with." In May 1945, the war ended. When Allied officers finally showed German scientists the complete fuse, the reaction was universal. Shock, disbelief, admiration. One engineer shook his head. "We could not have built this in 10 years, not even in 20. Another muttered, "We built rockets to the edge of space. They built a fuse that destroyed us." The proximity fuse had done more than save cities and fleets. It had shattered the myth of German technological supremacy. The Reich had prided itself on science, on being first, on leading. But in the end, it was beaten by a tiny glass tube, no bigger than a thumb, hidden inside a shell. Simple, elegant, lethal, and unstoppable. By 1945, the war had changed. Not with rockets, not with jets, but with fuse. Tiny glass tubes, circuits the size of a thumb. And suddenly, the battlefield was different. Before, artillery was guesswork. Shells landed in mud, buried in snow, exploded too late or too early. Now, they burst in the air, above trenches, above foxholes, above marching columns. The effect was catastrophic. German infantry who once ducked into ditches found no safety. Shrapnel rained down in steel storms. Machine gun nests that could pin down entire companies were silenced in seconds. Mortar crews were erased before they could fire. The battlefield itself had turned against them. The skies were no better. Once, Luftwaffe pilots mocked Allied flak. Black puffs in the distance, harmless fireworks, but no longer. Now the bursts erupted beside them. Too close. Always too close. Wings shredded. Engines torn apart. Cockpits engulfed in fire. One German ace later admitted, "It was as if the shells were guided. We could not escape." Every mission became suicide. The Luftwaffe, once feared, now feared the sky itself. Even Germany's wonder weapons crumbled. The V1 flying bomb, Hitler's terror over London, had once struck fear. Civilians braced for the buzz, prayed for silence, or waited for the explosion. Now, most never reached the city. The proximity fuse turned flak into a wall. V1s were swatted from the sky like flies. Londoners who once slept in fear now watched with awe as enemy bombs disintegrated midair. One child remembered, "We stopped hiding. We started watching. The sky protected us." The war had entered a new phase. The old rules, massed bombers, massed infantry, the thunder of artillery barrages, no longer applied. The Allies had rewritten them. Not with more men, not with bigger guns, but with smarter shells. It was a new kind of war, and the outcome was no longer in doubt. War is not only fought with steel, it is fought with belief. Belief that your weapons will work. Belief that you will live through the day. Belief that the enemy can be beaten. The proximity fuse gave that belief back to the Allies. Before, gunners fired blindly. Tens of thousands of rounds, little to show for it. They felt useless. One crewman recalled, "We fired until our arms ached, but we knew most of it was wasted." That despair vanished overnight. With VT fuses, every shot mattered. Every shell had a chance. Crews stopped feeling like cogs in a hopeless machine. They felt powerful. One sailor put it bluntly, "For the first time, I knew my gun could save my ship." Confidence surged. Infantry felt it too. When German counterattacks came, they no longer panicked. They trusted the artillery. They knew the shells would burst above the enemy, not vanish into the mud. One sergeant wrote home, "It is like fighting with angels over your head. The guns know where the enemy is." Morale soared. Soldiers advanced with confidence. The fuse was invisible, but its presence was everywhere. For the Germans, the effect was the opposite. Fear. Deep, gnawing fear. They called it Hexenschießen, witch shooting, magic fire. They didn't understand how it worked. They only knew it was merciless. Foxholes no longer safe. Forests no longer cover. Planes no longer shielded by speed or altitude. Everywhere they turned, death found them. One prisoner said, "It was as if the Americans had cursed us. Even the air hated us." This fear spread quickly. Rumors among infantry, whispers among pilots, reports among officers. The conclusion was the same. The Allies had weapons Germany could not match, and that broke something deeper than bone. It broke spirit. The proximity fuse was not just a tool of destruction. It was a weapon of psychology. It gave the Allies faith, and it robbed the Germans of hope. The war was not only about battles, it was about symbols. The V2 rocket symbolized German ambition, a weapon that touched space, that promised a future of terror from the skies. But the proximity fuse symbolized something else, American supremacy. It was not glamorous. It wasn't a rocket. It wasn't a jet. It wasn't a tank. It was a fuse, a tiny device hidden inside a shell. But that fuse represented the one thing America had above all others, the ability to combine science, industry, and secrecy into victory. Think about what it required. Miniaturized electronics, built tough enough to survive 20,000 Gs. Mass production, not hundreds, not thousands, but millions. Secrecy so tight that even soldiers who fired the shells barely knew what they were using. It was science. It was industry. It was discipline. All rolled into one. German scientists admitted it openly after the war. "We built rockets," one said. But rockets did not stop the Allies. Their fuse did. Another confessed, "We thought we were ahead. We were not. We were behind, far behind." The proximity fuse became a symbol of the new world. A world where electronics mattered as much as steel. A world where miniature circuits could win battles just as surely as tanks and planes. It was a quiet revolution, and it pointed to the wars of the future. Missiles, guided bombs, smart weapons, all of them owed their birth to the tiny glass tube inside a shell. For America, it was proof that its factories could outproduce the Reich, proof that its scientists could outthink German engineers, proof that its secrecy could hold. One general summed it up: the atomic bomb ended the war, but the proximity fuse saved it. By 1945, the Allies didn't just have stronger armies, they had smarter weapons, and the world saw what that meant. Technology had tipped the scales, and Germany was stunned to realize it had been beaten not only by men in uniform, but by the invisible genius inside a shell, the symbol of American supremacy. March 1945, the Rhine River, the last great barrier into Germany. Hitler promised it would be a wall. He swore no Allied soldier would cross alive. German artillery dug in. Mortars zeroed on every crossing. Machine guns lined the far bank. Every bridge blown, every ferry sunk. The Rhine was supposed to be the Reich's shield, but the Allies had a secret weapon. The first shells screamed overhead. German infantry braced. They knew the drill. Shells hit dirt, buried in mud. Shrapnel wasted. That was how artillery always worked, but not this time. The shells burst in the air, above trenches, above foxholes. Shrapnel rained down like steel rain. Entire squads shredded before they could fire a shot. Machine gun nests silenced instantly. Mortar crews erased. The defenders broke. American infantry surged forward. Pontoon bridges unfolded. Boats churned across. German counterattacks tried to stop them. Every time, proximity-fused artillery shattered them. Columns caught in the open were obliterated. Reinforcements never reached the river. One German officer later admitted, "It was not a battle, it was execution. The shells hunted us." For Allied troops, the crossing felt unstoppable. They had feared the Rhine. They expected heavy losses. Instead, they advanced with confidence. One sergeant wrote home, "We walked into Germany under a shield of fire that never missed." The Rhine was crossed. The Reich's last barrier was gone, and the road to Berlin lay open. April 1945. Okinawa, the last, bloodiest battle of the Pacific. The Japanese threw everything into it. Planes, ships, soldiers, and desperation. Kamikaze, thousands of them. Young men in fragile planes, flying bombs with wings, hurling themselves at the American fleet. It was terror in daylight, death with an engine. Before, kamikazes had been nearly unstoppable. A single hit could cripple a destroyer. 2 hits could sink a carrier. Even with hundreds of guns blazing, too many got through. But not now, not with proximity fuses. The American fleet bristled with guns, 5-inch mounts, Bofors, Oerlikons, all loaded with VT shells. The first wave of kamikazes screamed in. The sky erupted. Shells burst beside wings. Fuselages shattered. Planes fell in fireballs before they reached the ships. One sailor shouted, "It was like swatting flies with thunder." Wave after wave came. Dozens of kamikazes, diving, twisting, searching for targets. And wave after wave died. The air around the fleet became a killing zone. Bursts tracked every dive. Planes exploded mid-descent. Ships were still hit, but fewer. Much fewer. For the first time, the U.S. Navy felt it could survive the storm. Japanese survivors were stunned. One pilot who turned back wrote later, "It was hopeless. Their fire burst beside us, not around us. We died before we could strike." What was meant to be Japan's final weapon of terror turned into mass suicide. The kamikazes never broke the fleet. The battle raged for weeks. Okinawa burned. Soldiers bled on the beaches and hills. Civilians suffered in the crossfire. But offshore, the fleet endured because of the proximity fuse. One admiral said it flatly, "Without it, we would have lost half the fleet. With it, we held the line." By the end, Japan's skies were empty. Its young pilots gone, its last gamble wasted. Okinawa was hell. But it was also proof. Proof that the proximity fuse had saved thousands of lives. Proof that America's ships could survive anything. And proof that Japan's empire was finished. April 1945. Berlin was burning. The Red Army closed from the east. The Western Allies pressed from the west. The Reich was in its death throes. And still, the shells fell. American and British artillery unleashed VT rounds by the thousands. German units massing for counterattacks were torn apart before they could move. Infantry formations shredded in seconds. Soldiers stopped trusting trenches, stopped trusting forests, even stopped trusting night, because the shells always found them. One German lieutenant later said, "We could not breathe without shells bursting above us. It felt like the sky itself hated us." The psychological toll was crushing. Men deserted. Officers surrendered whole companies. The myth of German resistance shattered under airbursts that seemed guided by fate. Meanwhile, in the skies, the Luftwaffe was gone. Its few remaining planes tried to rise. They were slaughtered instantly. Flak no longer fired blind. It fired smart. Pilots who once mocked the black puffs of flak now saw their comrades shredded midair. One survivor said bitterly, "Every cloud of fire was death. There was no escape. Even Hitler's miracle weapons failed. The V-1 buzz bombs swatted from the sky. The V-2 rockets too fast to stop, but strategically useless. The Reich had promised vengeance. What it got instead was annihilation." In the final days, German scientists themselves admitted defeat. Captured in their labs, they spoke with awe of the fuse. "We built rockets to the edge of space," one engineer said, "but it was their fuse that destroyed us on the ground." Another muttered, "We were beaten by glass tubes, small glass tubes." On the front lines, the Allies advanced with confidence. Every bridge crossed, every town taken, protected by artillery that never missed. The proximity fuse was invisible, silent, unknown to most soldiers, but its shadow hung over every battlefield. May 1945. Germany surrendered. The Reich was gone. Its cities rubble, its armies broken. The Allies stood victorious. And deep in the paperwork of generals and scientists, one phrase repeated again and again. The VT fuse shortened the war. It was the end of an empire, and the triumph of a weapon no bigger than a man's fist. When the war ended, the headlines screamed about one thing: the atomic bomb, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, mushroom clouds rising into history. The world believed that was the weapon that won the war. But inside the Pentagon, and in quiet reports between generals, another phrase repeated: the proximity fuse shortened the war. It had saved London from V-1s. It had broken the back of the Luftwaffe. It had shredded German counterattacks in the Ardennes. It had turned the kamikaze into suicide without purpose. It had given Allied infantry the confidence to advance, and Allied sailors the belief they could survive. The fuse had been everywhere, and yet almost no one knew. There were no photographs of mushroom clouds, no iconic images of cities flattened in an instant. The fuse was silent, invisible, hidden inside shells. Soldiers who fired them didn't know what they were using. Sailors who cheered as planes fell never saw the tiny glass tubes that made it possible. It was the most important weapon most people never heard of. One American general said it plainly: The atomic bomb ended the war, but the proximity fuse saved it. Secrecy had hidden it during the conflict, and after victory, it remained in the shadows. Even veterans who had fired thousands of VT shells went home never knowing what those two letters really meant. It was a ghost weapon, a weapon that had shaped every battle of the last 2 years of the war, yet lived only in classified reports and whispers among scientists. When, years later, the story began to surface, historians were stunned. They realized that without the fuse, the Pacific might have dragged on for years. The Rhine crossing could have been a bloodbath. The Ardennes might have lasted longer. London could have burned under V1 fire. And the Navy might have lost carriers by the dozen off Okinawa. But with it, the war bent. The war broke. The war ended sooner. It was not a glamorous weapon. It was not built to impress. But it was the silent hero of victory, the hidden hand that tipped the scales. And though it never had the fame of the bomb, it carried its own legacy, the dawn of a new kind of warfare. The war ended. The world changed. But the proximity fuse didn't disappear. It evolved. Engineers who had built it went on to build more. Guided missiles, anti-aircraft systems, radar-controlled guns. The fuse was the seed. Every smart weapon of the Cold War traced its lineage back to that tiny glass tube. Before the fuse, shells were dumb, fired and forgotten. They hit dirt, rock, or maybe the sky if they were lucky. After the fuse, shells could think. Not much, just enough. Enough to sense. Enough to choose the moment of death. That was the birth of modern precision. In Korea, VT fuses were still in service. In Vietnam, their descendants guided artillery over jungles. By the 1980s, electronics had shrunk again, this time into chips. But the principle remained. Weapons that knew when to strike. Weapons that made timing an art. All of it began in 1942, when a shell armed itself and burst beside a drone. Even space bore the mark. NASA rockets borrowed techniques first refined in fuse labs, miniaturized circuits, rugged electronics, the same minds that made a shell smart made satellites possible. The Cold War's race to orbit owed something to the secret weapon of World War II. German scientists admitted it after the war. We were ahead in rockets, one said. But the Americans were ahead in electronics. And in the end, electronics won. The lesson was clear. The future belonged not to brute force, but to brains in metal, tiny circuits, invisible power. That was the road ahead, and the proximity fuse had lit the path. After the war, the stories came out. Generals spoke, scientists wrote. Historians dug through files once marked top secret. And again, the same phrase appeared. The proximity fuse shortened the war. General Eisenhower called it one of the 3 most important weapons of World War II. General George Marshall ranked it alongside radar and the atomic bomb. Even Admiral Nimitz, who had commanded the Pacific Fleet, said, "Without the fuse, Okinawa would have been lost." It was praise without fanfare, but it was real. Captured German scientists, too, confessed their awe. One said, "We saw the fragments. We tried to copy them, but it was impossible." Another admitted, "This was the weapon that made us realize we could not win." For men who had built rockets and jets, the shock was absolute. They had been beaten by glass tubes, small, simple, perfect. Historians later looked back and shook their heads. They realized how close the war had been, how fragile London's survival, how dangerous the Ardennes could have become, how costly Okinawa would have been without it. The fuse had not ended the war like the bomb, but it had saved it, shaped it, and given the Allies time to finish it. Yet few remembered. There were no monuments to the fuse, no museums filled with shells. It was hidden inside artillery, fired, exploded, forgotten. But for those who knew, it was unforgettable. One historian wrote, "The atomic bomb got the headlines. The proximity fuse got the victory." Another called it the most important invention you've never heard of. The legacy was not just in weapons, it was in the lesson that science could tip the balance, that brains could defeat brute force, that sometimes the smallest thing on the battlefield could matter most. And so, in whispers and in footnotes, the Fuse lived on, a symbol of America's power, a warning to enemies, a quiet revolution in war. In the end, the German scientists had been right. It was 20 years ahead of its time, and it stunned them into silence.